What happens when a single man's ego and tactical brilliance collide with the rigid protocols of the greatest military operation in history? In March 1945, while Field Marshal Montgomery meticulously stockpiled thousands of tons of steel for a synchronized assault, General George Patton decided to rewrite the end of the war in total silence. Without permission and without a single artillery shell, he launched a gamble that left the German high command paralyzed and the Allied leadership in absolute shock. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Yet the Rhine River remained the one final, formidable barrier that kept the Allied armies from the heart of Berlin. For centuries, this wide, fast-flowing waterway had served as Germany's natural moat, and as the Allied forces closed in, the German Supreme Command West clung to the hope that the river would provide the breathing room needed to reorganize a final, desperate defense. Inside his headquarters at Bad Nauheim, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring surveyed his maps with a grim but calculated focus, knowing that his intelligence reports pointed toward a massive, overwhelming British assault in the north near Wesel. Kesselring understood the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his methodical, slow-moving nature, and he felt confident that the Germans had at least a week to prepare for the inevitable storm of steel that Montgomery would surely unleash. Montgomery's reputation for caution was well known across both sides of the front lines, as he was a man who preferred to stockpile months of supplies and thousands of artillery pieces before moving a single inch, ensuring that when he did strike, the risk was minimal and the force was overwhelming. Operation Plunder was the culmination of this philosophy, a massive set-piece operation involving 250,000 troops, 30,000 artillery pieces, and an aerial bombardment that promised to turn the eastern bank of the Rhine into a moonscape before the first boat even touched the water. German intelligence estimated that this assault would not materialize until the 24th or 25th of March, leaving the German defenders a narrow window to reinforce their positions and destroy any remaining infrastructure that could aid an Allied crossing. Meanwhile, to the south, General George Patton and his Third Army were driving eastward with a ferocity that defied the exhaustion of their recent victory in the Battle of the Bulge. Patton, a man driven by a legendary sense of destiny and an intense personal rivalry with Montgomery, viewed the upcoming British operation as a political maneuver designed to give the British Empire the glory of the final victory. He stood on the western bank of the Rhine near Mainz, staring across the churning water at the German heartland with a singular, burning ambition. He would cross the river first, and he would do it without the massive resources, the permission of Supreme Headquarters, or the knowledge of the world. The tension within the American command was palpable, as Patton's Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay, reminded the general that they lacked the official authorization and the necessary bridging equipment to attempt such a daring feat. Patton, however, was not a man to be deterred by the lack of paperwork or the absence of heavy equipment, famously retorting that he didn't need authorization to win a war, and that the British could keep their credit as long as his boots were the first to touch the eastern soil. He knew that if he asked for permission, the answer from General Eisenhower and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force would be a resounding no, as they would insist he wait for Montgomery's coordinated assault to ensure the safety of the troops. Just like that, Patton issued a series of orders that would effectively take the Third Army dark, commanding his staff to maintain absolute radio silence and to produce no written orders above the division level. He understood that the only way to beat Montgomery and catch the Germans off guard was to operate in a vacuum of information, where even the Allied high command in Reims would be unaware of his movements until the crossing was an accomplished fact. He ordered his engineers to scour the countryside for every available assault boat, civilian raft, and floating device they could find, effectively cobbling together a makeshift naval force under the very noses of the German observers who were preoccupied with the massive buildup in the north. While Montgomery was conducting high-profile press briefings and final inspections of his thousands of boats and aircraft, Patton was scouting the small, unassuming town of Oppenheim, where the Rhine was narrower and the German defenses were dangerously thin. German military doctrine suggested that any major river crossing should occur at the strongest defensive point after a prolonged period of suppression by heavy artillery. But Patton intended to do the exact opposite, by striking where the enemy felt most secure in their neglect. He realized that the Germans had concentrated their remaining reserves near Mainz, expecting a traditional, loud, and violent American assault, which left the quiet banks of Oppenheim virtually unguarded and ripe for an unconventional maneuver. Immediately, the engineers of the Third Army began the silent, grueling task of moving their scavenged boats to the water's edge under the cover of a moonless night on March 22, 1945. There were no booming cannons to herald their arrival, and no massive formations of bombers to clear the way. Instead, there was only the sound of muffled oars and the heavy breathing of the 5th Infantry Division as they prepared to step into the unknown. Patton had gambled everything on the belief that the Germans would be so focused on Montgomery's impending front door assault that they wouldn't even notice a thief slipping through the back window in the dead of night. The first wave of American soldiers climbed into small rubber rafts and plywood assault boats, pushing off into the cold, fast-moving currents of the Rhine with orders to maintain total silence at all costs. As they glided across the 1,500 feet of water, the eastern bank remained eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the hellish landscape of the Battle of the Bulge they had left behind only weeks prior. The German defenders on the other side were few and far between, consisting of scattered units who were more concerned with surviving the cold than watching for an impossible crossing that their own commanders had assured them could not happen for at least another 2 weeks. Suddenly, the first boots hit the mud of the eastern bank, and the silence of the night was broken only by the occasional frantic burst of German small arms fire as the surprised sentries realized too late that the Americans were already among them. These isolated pockets of resistance were quickly and efficiently neutralized by the infantry, who moved with a sense of urgency and purpose that only comes from knowing they were doing something they were never supposed to do. By midnight, an entire battalion had successfully made the transit, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, a full brigade was digging in and expanding the bridgehead, creating a secure perimeter that would soon support the weight of Patton's entire army. Back at the German Supreme Command West, Field Marshal Kesselring remained blissfully unaware of the disaster unfolding at Oppenheim, as his intelligence officers continued to reassure him that the only credible threat remained Montgomery's massive force in the north. The German High Command was a victim of its own rigid adherence to military doctrine, believing that because an American crossing at Oppenheim was improperly prepared, it simply wasn't happening in any meaningful capacity. This psychological blindness allowed Patton to funnel more and more men across the water, and by the time the first rays of dawn touched the Rhine, the 5th Infantry Division had established a formidable presence that no local German counterattack could hope to dislodge. In the early morning hours of March 23rd, the atmosphere at Patton's headquarters was one of suppressed electricity as the general finally allowed his communications officers to break the silence and send a brief, startling message to higher headquarters. The report was simple and devoid of the typical military flourish. Third Army crossed the Rhine last night near Oppenheim, bridgehead secure, minimal casualties, advancing inland. When this message arrived at the Supreme Headquarters in Reims, it was met with a mixture of disbelief and genuine fury from General Eisenhower's staff, who could hardly believe that Patton had once again acted without coordination and in direct violation of the established theater strategy. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, was reportedly livid at the news, seeing Patton's move as a reckless act of insubordination that threatened the delicate political balance between the American and British forces. However, Eisenhower himself, while annoyed by Patton's constant defiance, could not help but be impressed by the sheer audacity and efficiency of the operation, recognizing that while Patton had stolen Montgomery's spotlight, he had also achieved a strategic breakthrough of immense value. The Rhine had been breached without the loss of thousands of men, and the psychological barrier that had protected Germany for centuries had been shattered in a single night by a man who refused to wait for permission. Across the lines, the realization was finally beginning to dawn on the German commanders that their southern flank was now wide open, and the confusion that flooded their headquarters was absolute as they tried to reconcile the reality of the situation with their previous intelligence. They had prepared for a battering ram in the north, but they had been bypassed by a ghost in the south, and the sudden appearance of American armor on the eastern bank sent shockwaves through the crumbling Wehrmacht. The German generals scrambled to find reserves that didn't exist, while Patton, ever the opportunist, was already planning the next phase of his lightning-fast advance into the heart of the Reich. Patton's phone call to General Omar Bradley later that morning was a masterpiece of casual bravado, as he informed his superior that he was across the river and was already building a pontoon bridge. When Bradley, wary of Patton's antics, asked when he had crossed and why he hadn't informed anyone, Patton replied with a cheerful arrogance that he was telling him now, and that Bradley should come visit so they could walk across the Rhine together. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph for Patton, who knew that by the time Montgomery launched his official crossing the next day, the Third Army would already be miles deep into German territory, rendering the British massive preparations almost redundant in the eyes of history. This was the beginning of the end for the German defense of the West, a moment where the impossible became the inevitable, because one commander decided that doctrine was merely a suggestion. As the sun rose higher on March 23rd, the world was about to wake up to the news that the Rhine had fallen, and the race to Berlin was no longer a matter of if, but of how fast George Patton could drive his tanks. While the morning fog still clung to the dark, churning waters of the Rhine, the political shock waves of Patton's midnight crossing were already destabilizing the carefully constructed hierarchy of the Allied High Command. At the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Renthams, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat staring at the brief, almost nonchalant message from the Third Army, realizing that the entire strategic script for the final invasion of Germany had just been torn to pieces. His Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, paced the room with a fury that bordered on the volcanic, viewing Patton's unauthorized maneuver as a direct assault on the unity of the Allied command and a dangerous provocation to the British. Smith argued that Patton had bypassed every established channel, ignored every logistical safeguard, and intentionally humiliated Field Marshal Montgomery on the eve of the most important operation of his career. But Eisenhower, ever the pragmatist, saw the situation through a different lens, recognizing that while Patton's ego was a constant source of professional headaches, his ability to achieve the impossible with minimal resources was exactly what the war effort needed to break the German spirit. He knew that Montgomery would be absolutely incensed, but he also understood that you cannot court-martial a man for winning a battle that everyone else was too afraid to start. Just like that, the narrative of the war shifted from a slow, methodical grind to a high-speed race into the unknown, and General Omar Bradley found himself caught in the middle of this burgeoning storm. When Patton's voice crackled over the secure line to the 12th Army Group headquarters, Bradley felt a familiar mixture of admiration and exhaustion, knowing that George had once again forced his hand. Patton's announcement was not a request for support, but a statement of fact. His 5th Division was across, his engineers were already laying the foundations for a massive pontoon bridge, and he expected to have heavy armor rolling into the German interior by the afternoon. Bradley pointed out the staggering political implications, reminding Patton that Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin in less than 24 hours, and that the British would likely view this as a stab in the back. Patton merely laughed, his voice brimming with the confidence of a man who believed he was destined for this very moment, telling Bradley that while Montgomery was busy getting his boats wet, the Third Army would already be halfway to Frankfurt. By the morning of March 24, 1945, the engineering marvel of the Third Army was complete, as a sturdy pontoon bridge now spanned the Rhine at Oppenheim, built under the cover of darkness and the threat of German air attacks. Patton invited Bradley to join him for a walk that would soon become one of the most legendary, albeit controversial, moments of the entire European campaign. As they reached the center of the bridge with the cameras of Army photographers clicking in the distance, Patton stopped and looked out over the river that had defied conquerors since the time of the Romans. In a gesture of pure, unbridled defiance, he unzipped his fly and urinated into the Rhine, announcing to the world that he had been waiting to do exactly that since the day they landed on the beaches of Normandy. Bradley was mortified by the lack of decorum, but Patton was focused on the message it sent. The Great German Barrier was no longer a symbol of strength, but a target of American contempt. Immediately after this act of defiance, as they stepped onto the eastern bank, Patton deliberately tripped and fell to his hands and knees, grabbing a handful of German soil in a conscious imitation of William the Conqueror. He wanted the world to see that he wasn't just visiting, he was claiming this land as a victor, using the very earth beneath his fingernails to signal the total collapse of the Reich's sovereignty. While Patton was staging these iconic moments of psychological warfare, Field Marshal Montgomery was launching Operation Plunder with the weight of an entire empire behind him. The contrast could not have been more striking. While Patton had slipped across with a single division in a thief-like silence, Montgomery unleashed a literal storm of fire involving thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of paratroopers, and a creeping artillery barrage that could be heard for 50 miles. Montgomery's operation was a masterpiece of military science, a textbook execution of overwhelming force that achieved its objectives with the precision of a Swiss watch. However, the glory he had so carefully cultivated was already being eclipsed by the headlines coming out of the South, where the press was enamored with the story of the cowboy general who had beaten the hero of El Alamein across the river. Montgomery was reportedly furious, complaining to his staff that Patton's showboating was an unnecessary risk that ignored the carefully planned coordination of the Allied front. He viewed Patton's methods as chaotic and unprofessional, failing to see that the very chaos he despised was the primary weapon that was currently paralyzing the German high command. Even Winston Churchill, when informed of the situation, couldn't help but laugh at Patton's audacity, noting that while the British had moved with the resources of an empire, Patton had moved with the speed of a man who refused to wait for history to catch up to him. Inside the German bunkers, the mood was one of utter disbelief and mounting despair, as Field Marshal Kesselring demanded to know how an entire American army had managed to bypass their most formidable defenses without being detected. His intelligence chiefs could only offer excuses, explaining that Patton had ignored every rule of war by attacking a weak point without the necessary preparation that military doctrine demanded. Kesselring realized with a sinking feeling that fighting Patton was fundamentally different from fighting Montgomery. While Montgomery was a predictable battering ram, Patton was a ghost that could appear anywhere at any time. The German commanders began to use the phrase, "that's not supposed to happen," as a recurring joke, a bitter acknowledgement that the American general was playing a game for which they had no rules and no counters. The strategic impact of Patton's crossing was immediate and devastating, as it forced the Germans to spread their already thin reserves across multiple bridgeheads, effectively preventing them from concentrating their forces against Montgomery in the north. The Rhine, which was supposed to be the final line of defense that would buy the Reich months of time, had been breached in less than 24 hours. This sudden collapse broke the psychological back of the German resistance, as soldiers and civilians alike realized that no natural barrier could stop the Allied advance. Within days, multiple Allied armies were pouring across the river, inspired by the realization that the Rhine was not the impregnable fortress they had been led to believe, but a door that Patton had simply kicked open. As the Third Army's tanks roared eastward, the debate over the first crossing of the Rhine began to emerge, with some pointing to the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by the First Army earlier in the month. Patton, in his characteristic style, dismissed the Remagen crossing as a stroke of pure luck, an opportunistic moment where the Americans had simply found a bridge the Germans had failed to blow up. He took immense pride in the fact that his crossing at Oppenheim was a deliberate act of military art, a planned, executed, and secret operation that relied on skill and audacity rather than fortune. To Patton, finding a bridge was a gift, but building one under the nose of the enemy was a triumph of the will. The crossing at Oppenheim was the ultimate expression of Patton's philosophy of war, which prioritized speed, violence of action, and the refusal to accept the limitations of supposed to. He moved faster than his own logistics could handle. He attacked when he was expected to consolidate, and he crossed rivers that his superiors told him were impassable. This relentless drive was what made him the most feared Allied commander in the eyes of the Germans, who saw in him a reflection of their own blitzkrieg tactics, now turned against them with American industrial might. By the time the world fully grasped the significance of what had happened at Oppenheim, Patton was already deep into the heart of Germany, his eyes fixed on the final prize of Berlin. Suddenly, the German defense of the Western Front disintegrated into a series of isolated, desperate stands, as the sheer speed of Patton's advance prevented any cohesive reorganization. The thief in the night had not only entered the house, but had already set it on fire, and the German generals found themselves presiding over a collapse they could neither understand nor stop. The Rhine crossing was not just a tactical victory, it was a demonstration that in the chaos of war, the man who acts first and asks for forgiveness later is the one who writes the history books. Patton's legacy would forever be defined by this moment, where his personal rivalry and professional genius merged to strike the final, decisive blow against the heart of the Reich. But the human cost of this audacity was ever present, even if Patton rarely dwelled on it in his public pronouncements. The engineers who worked in the freezing water, the infantry who crossed in silent rubber boats, and the tankers who pushed their machines to the breaking point were the real architects of this victory. Patton's genius lay in his ability to inspire these men to do what they thought was impossible, to make them believe that they were part of a grand historic crusade that could not be stopped by rivers, mountains, or German steel. As the bridgehead at Oppenheim expanded, it became a funnel through which the full power of the American military was poured, ensuring that the end of the war would be measured in weeks rather than months. Eisenhower's final assessment of the operation, written long after the guns had fallen silent, acknowledged that Patton was the only commander who could have achieved such a result. He admitted that managing Patton was like trying to hold onto a lightning bolt, a constant struggle to keep him within the bounds of strategic sanity while simultaneously reaping the benefits of his brilliance. Eisenhower realized that without Patton's unorthodox and audacious methods, the crossing of the Rhine might have turned into a bloody stalemate, a repeat of the static warfare of the First World War that he was desperate to avoid. In the final days of March, the Allied armies stood poised to deliver the coup de grace, with Patton leading the charge across the open plains of Germany. The impossible crossing had become the standard by which all other operations were measured, a testament to the power of surprise and the importance of individual initiative in the face of rigid bureaucracy. The German generals, now mostly in captivity, would spend years reflecting on how their invincible barrier had been bypassed so easily, often returning to the same bewildered conclusion: that's not supposed to happen. The story of Patton at the Rhine is more than just a military anecdote. It is a study in the psychological dynamics of leadership and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome the constraints of doctrine. Patton refused to accept that the Rhine was a limitation, just as he refused to accept that his rank or his superiors could dictate the pace of his destiny. He was a man out of time, a warrior who believed in the ancient virtues of courage and speed, and who used those virtues to break the most modern and technological military machine the world had ever seen. As the sun set on the ruins of the Third Reich, the image of Patton standing on that pontoon bridge, defiant and triumphant, remained as a symbol of the American experience in the war. It was a victory of grit over planning, of intuition over intelligence, and of one man's refusal to wait for his turn to be great. The Rhine was crossed, the enemy was broken, and the path to peace was finally clear, all because George Patton decided that the script for the war was meant to be rewritten by the man bold enough to pick up the pen. Patton famously believed that audacity was the most important quality in a commander, while Montgomery believed in meticulous preparation. Given the outcome at the Rhine, do you think wars are won by the thieves who take risks or the battering rams who follow the rules? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.